Yeah, Matt Rothschild here.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in Madison, Wisconsin. Juan Gonzalez is in New York. Yes, we're broadcasting from here because the Progressive magazine is celebrating 100 years. That's right, it's its 100th anniversary. The Progressive is holding a two-day conference here in Madison. That includes, Howard Zinn and Naomi Klein, Robert Redford, Senator Russ Feingold, Dolores Huerta, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Ani DeFranco, and many more. I'm joined here in the studios of WYOU, which is public access TV in Madison, Wisconsin, by Matt Rothschild. He's the editor of the Progressive magazine. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Matt, and happy birthday.
Hey, thanks, Amy. It's great to be on again.
Well, talk about the 100 years of the Progressive. You have a great last issue, the Progressive, 100 years. I'm gonna, for our TV audience, this is a picture of it. Just go through that. Who started it? Starting in 1909.
We were founded by Fighting Bob LaFollette, the senator from Wisconsin here, who was one of the leaders of the progressive movement. But unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive imperialist, Fighting Bob LaFollette was a progressive anti-imperialist, and he used that word even. So what I saw and what the other editors saw as we went through every single issue over the last 100 years was a lot of continuity, a lot of principles that have stayed the same against foreign meddling by the U.S. government, against corporate power. Fighting Bob LaFollette said that was the central struggle of his day, to take on the special interests, the corporate powers that had so much influence not only over the economy but over the political system. Plus, the Progressive, it was called LaFollette's Weekly early on. It was a suffragist magazine because Robert LaFollette's wife, Belle Case LaFollette, was one of the biggest suffragists here in the Midwest. She'd go around with Jane Addams on the back of trains and give speeches to huge crowds. So we've always been committed to equal rights for everybody in this country.
So talk about the positions, for example, on the First World War.
Well, this was one of the defining moments of the Progressive magazine. Fighting Bob LaFollette opposed U.S. entry into World War I. He was just one of 5 or 6 senators to do so. He was called a traitor. He was hanged in effigy, even on the campus right here in Madison, Wisconsin. They tried to kick him out of the U.S. Senate. He managed to stay in the Senate and get reelected, and then he ran for president in 1925. But his speeches from 1917, which we reproduced in the Progressive, and we have in this snippets of in this anniversary issue, could have been said, any time by, Robert Byrd in the lead up to the war against Iraq.
Matt Rothschild, back in 1909, it was magazines like the Progressive, McClure's, and others that were publishing writers like Upton Sinclair, Ray Stannard Baker, Ida Tarbell, all the great muckrakers of that era. How do you assess the magazine industry today, and what kind of cutting-edge role does it have in questioning corporate power?
Well, we've been still taking on corporate power a great deal right now. I mean, we've been writing articles about this ridiculous bank bailout that Ralph Nader was talking about a little bit. We've been also covering civil liberties issues under the Bush-Cheney administration and how they were eroded. And we're looking at Barack Obama, how he's changing things or not changing things. I mean, he says he can keep people indefinitely in detention at Bagram Air Force Base. What difference is that from Bush and Cheney at Guantanamo? So, we're still fighting corporate power. We're still fighting for civil liberties and human rights and against these foreign interventions that just help the corporations. Those are cardinal principles of the Progressive magazine.
Well, the Progressive certainly is, but how do you assess the rest of the magazine industry in the country right now?
Well, the magazine industry is in crisis. The newspaper industry is in crisis. A lot of the news weeklies don't know how to function right now. The idea that you have a Newsweek magazine right now, that's antiquated. That's a dinosaur. People get the news within minutes or hours. They don't need to go find it a week later as to what happened. So the intellectual reason for being for these magazines is kind of kaput, and their economic model is kaput too. So I think magazines, to the extent that they're going to be able to survive, and the Progressive is going to be able to survive, need to become more like books, or need to take a higher altitude look at the news and do investigative reporting and give people analysis that they can't find anywhere else. But if you just say, what did Barack Obama say at his press conference yesterday? Newspapers and magazines are going to go.
Matt Rothschild, let's talk about this body of work of the last 100 years. Talk about the investigative pieces you're most proud of over this period. And remember, especially for young people, I mean, the lack of historical context we have today, maybe some of what you're going to talk about, no one even knows what you're referring to.
Well, I hope that's not the case, but maybe it is. In 1954, the Progressive published a huge expose of Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy was, this red-baiting, anti-communist, hysterical hunter here from Wisconsin, of all places. And in 1954, at the height of his power, the Progressive magazine published a special issue showing what a fraud he was. And that issue sold 300,000 copies, even though the Progressive only had 30,000 subscribers. So that had a huge influence. And then in 1984, the Progressive published what I think was one of the best investigative pieces ever by Alan Nairn called Behind the Death Squads. Alan Nairn went to Central America, went to El Salvador, and actually talked to some of these death squad leaders who confessed to him that they were working for the CIA and that the CIA had established these death squads, not just in the Reagan administration, but all the way back to the sainted JFK, and that JFK and Johnson and on up had financed them, trained them, and funded and armed them. And as a consequence, 60, 70,000 people were slaughtered in El Salvador. That's the kind of intervention that we've shed a light on. Torture didn't begin with Bush and Cheney.
Well, what about in this quarter of a century now, the kind of work that you've been doing?
Well, our investigative reporter, Anne-Marie Cusack, who's now a professor down in Chicago, she won a George Polk Award for a piece called Stunning Technology. This was more than 10 years ago, where she showed that these stun belts, these stun guns, and all sorts of hideous electronic devices that police forces have all across the country are going to kill people. And sure enough, they've killed people.
You also have a whole section in this latest issue of The Progressive that goes through the 100 years of, civil rights moments and writers. You have James Baldwin's letter to his nephew.
Yeah, this is probably the best single essay we ever published. This is James Baldwin writing in December 1962. It was an assigned article by him. And he was writing a letter to his nephew who has the same name. And he was telling young James Baldwin, 15, that the American society wants him to perish, wants him to totally fail, to be no more than mediocre and to consider himself inferior. But Uncle James Baldwin was telling his nephew, don't believe it, don't let them enforce inferiority upon you. It's one of the most moving essays I've ever read. I've read it now about 20 times, and every time I read it, it just grabs me.
Well, Matt Rothschild, obviously the Progressive has been functioning and writing, producing all of these great investigations and stories for years, yet the circulation remains relatively small compared to many other publications. What is the potential in terms of shared resources, between other progressive publications that are on the scene, as well as other progressive media, in terms of being able to reach a critical mass to get information needed out to the American people? Have you explored any potentials for working together with other publications and other progressive media?
Sure, we work together in something called the Media Consortium, which is a grouping of now, I think, hundreds of organizations in the alternative media. Sometimes we swap our circulation lists so that other magazines and organizations on the left can grow at a little cost on at our fault anyway. And then, we try to work as collaboratively as possible. We throw our stuff up on the web, and we just hope that other people pick it up. It's not like we all need to merge into one, The Progressive or In These Times or Mother Jones with The Nation. I think it's good to have a multiplicity of voices, but certainly we don't consider ourselves competitors. We're all kind of colleagues in the same alternative media role and idea.
Can you talk, Matt Rothschild, about Erwin Knoll, the longtime editor before you of The Progressive, and the work he did around nuclear weapons?
Erwin Knoll, first of all, was an incredible man. He and his family fled the Nazis from Vienna, Austria, in 1938, barely got out. And he was, by the time he was in high school, he was editing the daily newspaper in high school in New York City. So he was a genius. He was most proud of this 1979 article, The H-Bomb Secret, How We Got It, Why We're Telling It. And in this case, which is now a landmark First Amendment case, the U.S. government put a gag in the mouths of the Progressive for more than 6 months. It told us we couldn't publish the article. It was a prior restraint that was unprecedented. And ultimately, the Progressive prevailed. And the important part of this article was to say, look, the government can stamp secret on all the documents it wants about nuclear weapons. It's not going to make it one bit safer. The only thing that's going to make it safer is getting rid of these nuclear weapons.
What about that issue of surveillance over the years?